Hello, my name is Stuart Ivinson and I'm the librarian at the Royal Armouries in Leeds. And today I'd like to introduce you to this lovely specimen, Domenico Angelo's School of Fencing. This is Up in Arms. Fencing, of course, began as training with weapons for self-defence. But by the 18th century it was also considered an important gentlemanly accomplishment. Domenico Angelo was one of the greatest fencing masters of the 18th century, and this book was his great work. Just in case you're wondering, no, I am not wearing gloves for handling this rare book. That's because the paper that it's on is in very good condition, but if there were any tears or nicks in the edges of the paper, a cotton glove can actually snag and catch on those, and it has been known to make damage even worse. Current archival practice is basically, as long as your hands are clean and bone dry, which mine are, then you are less likely to do any damage to the paper by handling with clean, dry hands than you are with gloved hands. We know very little about most of the authors of fencing manuals or combat treatises. Some of them we only have their name, whereas others are completely anonymous. We're very fortunate, however, because Domenico Angelo's eldest son Henry left a large body of memoirs and biography, so we have a very useful but probably biased account of Domenico Angelo's life, times and activities. So before we delve into the book itself, it would be worthwhile having a look at the life and times of the author. Domenico Angelo Malavolti Tremomondo was born in Livorno in Italy in about 1717. His father was a wealthy merchant and his mother was a minor member of the Italian nobility. It's probable that he started to learn fencing while living in Italy, but in about 1744 his father sent him to Paris in order to study business. Now, Paris at this time was the very centre of the Enlightenment, and another reason for his father sending him there was probably so that he could gain a much broader, more modern education and become a more rounded individual and hope to rise in society. While in Paris, Domenico was drawn into the world of fencing and dancing, both of which he excelled at, and also fencing in the French style, and he studied under the great French fencing master Monsieur Taillegory. He gained a great reputation as a fencer, and it was at an exhibition of fencing that Domenico gained the eye of and fell under the spell of the Irish actress Margaret Peg Woffington. She was on tour in Paris at the time, and when she returned to London, Domenico went with her, and thence on to Dublin when she returned home. After their affection cooled and their liaison came to an end, Domenico moved back to London. In 1755, he married a young lady called Elizabeth Johnson, and later that year, his skills as a horseman gained him the position of Master of the Horse for the 10th Earl of Pembroke. He was now moving in aristocratic circles, where his particular skills had the chance of being noticed by potentially very wealthy benefactors. In about 1758, he was appointed by Augusta, the Dowager Princess of Wales, to be the fencing master for her sons, George, Prince of Wales, and Edward, Duke of York. By now well established, well connected and well heeled, Domenico bought himself a house on Soho Place in 1761, and there he set up a school for teaching fencing, and it very quickly became one of the premier places in London to study fencing, horsemanship and gentlemanly deportment. His first pupil was the Duke of Devonshire, and with people like that and other wealthy benefactors and students, Domenico's place in high society was more than assured. Angelo then turned his attention to codifying his teaching on fencing, and in 1763 he published the book L'École des Armes avec l'explication générale des principales attitudes et positions concernant l'escrime. Please excuse my French. The publication was financed by a subscription from over 200 of his wealthy clients, and 47 engravings were produced by the famous artist James Gwyn, Royal Academy. The drawings themselves were all taken from life, and Domenico himself was the principal model. And there he is. This brings us to the book that we have here, published in 1765. The 1763 edition was published in French, because French was the language of education and taste, adopted by most of Angelo's wealthy benefactors and clients. It's also probably the language that he was the most versed in, considering his Paris education. It quickly became obvious, though, that an English edition would appeal to a much broader clientele and be far more successful, and thus the 1765 English translation was born. The English translation, The School of Fencing, with a general explanation of the principal attitudes and positions peculiar to the art, appeared in several editions, but none were as lavish or as beautiful as this first edition from 1765. Dedicated to Princes William Henry and Henry Frederick, both of whom were pupils, it is the only edition in which the engravings were hand-coloured. It is also the only one to have parallel English and French text, as we can see here. It's thought that Angelo was assisted in producing the translation by his great friend, the English-French diplomat and spy, the Chevalier d'Eon, who was another former pupil of Monsieur Tailleguri in Paris. The sword of choice for the gentleman about town in the 17th century had been the long, slender rapier. By the 18th century, however, this had been supplanted by the shorter, small sword, which was both shorter in blade and had a simpler hilt form. This meant that it was a much better costume accessory, far less likely to snag or get in the way as you made your way around. The small sword was also a very nimble weapon, which allowed for a very fast, graceful and deadly fencing style to evolve, and it was this style which was adopted by the French and therefore by Angelo himself. The School of Fencing primarily teaches use of the small sword and also the fencing foil, but there are also additional sections, including weapons in the offhand such as the dagger, and also the cloak and the lantern for blinding your opponent in night engagements. There is also a section on the use of the small sword against the military broadsword, as Angelo terms it, or sabre as we might think of it. It's evident from numerous anecdotes about Angelo's life that his system of fencing was not just all about grace, deportment and gentlemanly behaviour, but it was still an effective and efficient system of self-defence, because Angelo was forced upon numerous occasions to defend himself in street brawls. In its day, this book was recognised as a clear, concise and useful guide to fencing. The author was applauded for his emphasis on gentlemanly deportment and grace, not just actions for self-defence. It also stood out from other contemporary fencing manuals in its sheer size and the quality of its engravings. We can compare it to other books of a similar period, and we can see that it is both much larger and the quality of the illustrations far surpasses those of its contemporaries. We have here a copy of Monsieur Labat's work from 1696, a much smaller book, and the images don't really stand up to comparison. Similarly, you have Henry Blackwell's English Fencing Master from 1730, so a generation or so earlier than Angelo himself. Again, we have a small sword manual, but again, we can actually see that the engravings, although they are quite good, they just don't match up here. And then the final example is one from slightly later than Angelo, Manuel Antonio de Brea, 1805, and again, the illustrations are far inferior. To me, this seems to say that the School of Fencing was the book on the subject, and if you had this book, you didn't need any others. I think it's very telling of the book's success in its own lifetime that the text by Domenico Angelo was adopted in its entirety by Denis Diderot and Jean de Albe in their, for the section on fencing in their great learned work, the Encyclopedia. They had the option of taking texts from absolutely anywhere, and they did explain themselves, it being a French work, they explained the reason why they had taken Angelo's English text was simply because it was the best. The images which they used, however, weren't the originals. They were redrawn and scaled down, so it does lose some of its appeal. Domenico handed over the running of his school in Soho Square in 1780 to his eldest son Henry, and he retired to Eton, where he continued to teach and practice fencing at Eton College until his eventual death in 1802. So popular was the work that he had created that it was reprinted numerous times, and then in 1787 Henry reissued it in a smaller format. This edition, as we can see again, is both smaller than the original, and once more the engravings aren't as good. So here we can compare the two. And I think you'll agree, if you could afford the original, you would have had it. Today, Angelo's book is viewed as one of the first works on modern fencing, and it has been hugely influential in the development of the sport that we know today. There are only 7 other copies known to exist worldwide in public collections. The only other one in the UK is at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. The Royal Armouries copy of this book is in very good condition. The colours of the engravings are as bright as they were on the day that they were first painted, although 2 of the engravings, as you can see in this one, have been altered by the addition of pencil marks. This suggests that although Domenico Angelo was undoubtedly a master of his art, at least one previous owner of this book thought that some of his postures could be improved upon. I guess everyone's a critic. I hope that you've enjoyed hearing about this lovely old book, which is undoubtedly one of the great treasures of the Royal Armouries collection. We've just published a facsimile edition of the School of Fencing, so you too can now own copies of these beautiful engravings, complete with ink spots and later pencil corrections. And you can find a link to it in the description. Thank you very much for watching.